The Allied advance through France had been much more rapid than the planners had anticipated, and as the supply lines were now stretched to the very limit, several generals had drawn up alternative strategies for the invasion of Germany. These new plans would not only better utilize the overstretched Allied resources, but keep the initiative against the retreating German armies, preventing them drawing breath and mounting a coordinated defense. The original Allied plan for breaking into Germany would utilize three massive army groups with American, British, Free French and Canadian armies drawn up along a continuous line opposite the German border. The armies would first have to secure the great port of Antwerp and be completely resupplied from Britain. When fully up to strength, the Allies would advance on a broad front behind two main thrusts towards the River Rhine. Once the west of the Rhine had been cleared completely of all German resistance, the Allies would mount a crossing at numerous points along the river. Once the Rhine was finally breached, the defenseless Ruhr industry could be encircled, quickly occupied, and the war brought to a rapid conclusion. The new proposals, instead of a broad front advance, called for just one narrow thrust into the heart of the Reich. The British wanted to attack through the north of Germany, while the Americans proposed their assault should penetrate further south and strike for the Nazi heartland. Both the British and American generals believed that if their strategy was the one implemented, then the war could be over by the end of October 1944. The Allied Supreme Commander, examining the alternative strategies for the invasion of Germany, could clearly see the benefits of each. The broad advance would need many weeks for the exhausted armies to recover and resupply, but it did have the advantage of producing a certain outcome. The alternative narrow thrust, although it would have a much less predictable result, could be mounted immediately. An immediate narrow thrust that could soon end the war was a highly attractive proposition. But political considerations weighed against such a move. Anglo-American relations were strained enough without allowing one ally to reap all the glory. It was decided to maintain the original strategy of a broad front advance and complete the resupplying of the armies before beginning the final assault. Hitler and his senior Wehrmacht officers understood clearly that the only possible hope the Reich had for avoiding defeat was to undermine and destroy the alliance formed against them. The Germans planned to effect this with a combination of all-out counterattacks, deadly new revenge weapons, and fortified fixed defenses. To demoralize the American forces still further, German intelligence used cleverly targeted propaganda. Leaflets and radio broadcasts continually told the American GIs that while they were doing all the fighting, the British were resting in the quiet sectors, saving their own lives at American expense. If the Allies did manage to penetrate as far as the German frontier, they would meet formidable fixed defenses. Even before the outbreak of war, the Third Reich had begun fortifying its borders. The West Wall, better known to the Allies as the Siegfried Line, was a series of fortifications stretching all along the German boundary with France. It was made up of pillboxes, anti-tank obstacles and mines. But since the Germans had banked on halting the Allies in Normandy, the West Wall had been allowed to decay. In the autumn of 1944, it was hastily improved and reinforced, and although most of the reinforcements were youths and old men, they would be extremely well armed. The Ruhr, Germany's industrial heartland, lay less than 50 miles from the Reich's border. The Ruhr's main protection was the West Wall, or Siegfried Line, 3 miles deep and running from the southern border all the way to Holland. Before the Allies could enter the Ruhr, they would have to cross several natural barriers, one of the greatest being the River Ruhr. The Ruhr was dammed in 7 places, and the largest dam, the Schwammeneuil, was 180 feet high. These dams could be opened by German engineers at any time, making the river totally impassable, or cutting off any enemy forces that had already crossed. 25 miles east of the Ruhr was the River Rhine, one of the largest and fastest flowing rivers in Europe. All the Rhine's bridges had been primed with explosives to be detonated when the Allies were just a few miles away, making an Allied forced crossing extremely hazardous. In addition to fixed defences, the Germans had improvised several tactics to prevent the Allies from crossing the rivers Ruhr and Rhine. Speedboats were packed with 100 pounds of explosives and were intended to be aimed at bridges or pontoons being constructed by the enemy. The crew would jump off at the last moment, and the boat would race on to its target. The German soldiers defending the Reich were under strict orders never to give ground. But if forced to withdraw, they were to leave nothing intact for the Allies. Every single bridge and every vehicle that could not be taken away was to be destroyed. The Germans had to make the assault on the Reich as difficult and as costly as possible. Every day that the war was prolonged was another day for the alliance to break and for the Germans to wrench victory from the jaws of defeat. General Dwight Eisenhower became the supreme commander of the Allied Expeditionary Force in January 1944, promoted over 100 more senior generals. Eisenhower had a difficult dual task as supreme commander: to liaise with senior politicians and to lead an Allied army made up from a great many different nations. However, Eisenhower had extraordinary political and diplomatic abilities that would be of priceless value in leading the campaign ahead. Eisenhower was greatly admired by Roosevelt, who considered him one of the most able commanders in the United States Army, and he was on excellent terms with Prime Minister Churchill. Eisenhower had spent more than a year in England, where he had grown to love and be loved by the British people. As a result, he was very sympathetic to Britain's particular needs and problems. However, Eisenhower's close relationship with the British was occasionally prone to irritate Roosevelt, who, distancing himself more and more from Great Britain, felt that the official chain of command was being too frequently bypassed. The growing Anglo-American